Tonight, we begin with a development that U.S. officials had anticipated, analysts had warned about, and Pentagon strategists had prepared for. A confrontation that unfolded not over weeks or months, but in a matter of hours. Hours that reshaped the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. Hours that tested alliances forged over decades. Hours that may have altered the trajectory of U.S.-China relations for years to come. What Beijing did today crossed a line that Washington had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, Taipei did not hesitate. They responded with clarity, with conviction, and with courage. For months now, there had been signals, not from official diplomatic channels, not from formal government statements, just signals, that China was preparing something unprecedented. Beijing has been aggressive, yes, but they have been calculated in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a predictability, almost a choreography. But what set off alarm bells in Washington this week was that the rhythm went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Chinese military communications know the indicators. The encrypted traffic between Beijing and the Eastern Theater command the movement patterns of naval assets in the Taiwan Strait, the diplomatic messaging through back channels, the sudden consolidation of forces. Near coastal staging areas, all of that went quiet. And whenever Beijing goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. The catalyst came Tuesday morning when the Biden administration formally approved a $2.3 billion arms package to Taiwan, the largest single transfer of defensive weapons to the island in over a decade. The package included advanced F-16 fighter jets, Patriot missile defense systems, Harpoon anti-ship missiles, and perhaps most significantly, HIMARS precision rocket systems. Beijing had warned for years that such a transfer would constitute a red line. Washington crossed that line. And now we are living with the consequences. Clapperboard Section C's a revelation 3-4 minutes. Early Wednesday morning, U.S. Indo-Pacific Command detected what they described as unprecedented military mobilization across multiple Chinese theater commands, including aircraft carrier movements that had not been observed in over 18 months. These are the kinds of assets that Beijing only deploys when they are signaling something very specific. Readiness for conflict, preparation for blockade, or demonstration of overwhelming force. Intelligence officials didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that China was changing its strategic posture. And when a nuclear-armed superpower shifts posture without explanation, even by small degrees, the entire national security apparatus pays attention. Within hours, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs summoned the U.S. ambassador to Beijing for what officials described as an extraordinarily tense meeting lasting over 3 hours. Satellite imagery showed Chinese destroyer groups repositioning across the Taiwan Strait. Fighter jets scrambled from bases in Fujian province, and for the first time since 2022, Chinese military aircraft crossed the median line of the Taiwan Strait in formations exceeding 40 aircraft. This was not a drill. This was not routine. This was a message. Clapperboard Section D, the warning response, 3-4 minutes. The warning issued by Beijing tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Senior officials after emergency meetings described Washington's arms transfer as reckless, destabilizing, and perhaps most importantly, a direct provocation requiring proportional response. That last phrase is what has Pentagon officials most concerned tonight. Proportional response in Beijing's lexicon does not mean diplomatic protest. It means action. But intimidation only works if the target hesitates. Taiwan did not. In fact, their response today was among the most defiant we've seen in decades. Here's what we know. Within 6 hours of Beijing's warning, Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense activated its air defense systems across the island. These weren't the standard readiness protocols. These were full mobilization orders, systems that Taiwan only deploys when they are preparing to defend against imminent threat. President Lai Ching-te addressed the nation in a televised statement that left no room for ambiguity. He stood before cameras and declared that Taiwan would not be intimidated, coerced, or conquered. Clapperboard Section E. Detailed breakdown. 5 minutes tonight. Regional intelligence sources confirmed that Taiwan launched enhanced surveillance operations across the Taiwan Strait, including maritime patrol aircraft that had recently been upgraded for what analysts believe was exactly this scenario. Taiwan's military responded before Beijing could establish air superiority. They activated coastal defense batteries. They deployed naval vessels to strategic choke points. They scrambled fighter squadrons that were positioned to intercept any incursion. In other words, Taiwan targeted the psychological warfare campaign at its foundation. The assumption that the island would capitulate under pressure. This is what made Washington's support so critical. China's military mobilization wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of pressure that could force capitulation if left unanswered. And Taiwan, understanding that fully, responded with force. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't escalate rhetorically without action. They didn't wait for international consensus to form. They demonstrated immediate defensive capability. They showed the world they were prepared. The message was unmistakable. Taiwan will defend itself. And here's where the story becomes even more consequential. War. U.S. intelligence analysts now believe that Beijing's latest moves were designed to test the resolve of the Biden administration after months of domestic political distraction. China wanted to see whether Washington would back down under pressure, whether Taiwan would fracture internally, whether the alliance would show cracks. But instead, the opposite happened. Washington didn't waver. They issued a joint statement with allies that was so unified, so unambiguous, that even Beijing noticed. You don't get Beijing's attention easily. But today, the Democratic Alliance did. Defense analysts speaking with NBC News under anonymity described China's strategy as coercive gradualism, a way to slowly normalize aggressive behavior until resistance becomes unthinkable. But Taiwan and its allies proved today that they remain both vigilant and resolute. Their responses were not only swift, they were coordinated so precisely that Beijing's timeline was disrupted before it could gain momentum. That coordination matters because it shows integration between Taipei, Washington, Tokyo, and other regional partners. So, it shows that Taiwan is not standing alone. They are standing at the center of a network. As reports continued, coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of the Allied response. The United States repositioned the USS Ronald Reagan carrier strike group, forcing Chinese naval planners to recalculate their operational assumptions. Japan's self-defense forces activated radar systems in Okinawa that had been upgraded in the last 18 months, specifically to monitor Chinese military activity. Maddow, Australia's defense ministry, operating through intelligence sharing agreements, reportedly provided real-time satellite data used by Taiwan to track Chinese aircraft movements. This wasn't just deterrence. This wasn't just deterrence. This wasn't just diplomatic messaging. This was operational coordination. This was strategic integration. And strategic integration is the one thing Beijing has struggled to counter since the formation of AUKUS. For every advance China has made in military capability, the Democratic Alliance has countered with something that complicates Beijing's calculations exponentially. Remember, Beijing thought the arms deal would divide American political opinion. They thought international fatigue over Ukraine would limit appetite for another confrontation. They thought Taiwan's new president would be more cautious than his predecessor. They thought economic interdependence would make Washington hesitate. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Bipartisan support for Taiwan is holding firm. Allied coordination is stronger than it's been in years. President Lai has proven more assertive than Beijing anticipated, and Washington has signaled that economic considerations will not override security commitments. What makes this moment so significant and so dangerous is that Beijing's latest moves happened at a time when President Xi Jinping is under enormous internal pressure. Hardliners want military action to demonstrate strength. Economic reformers want stability to restore growth. Nationalists want tangible progress on reunification. Pragmatists want to avoid a confrontation that could collapse the economy. Xi is balancing these demands while managing the worst economic conditions China has faced in decades. Sir, hear it. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. The arms deal gave XY's domestic critics ammunition. It made him look weak at a moment when he cannot afford to look weak. And that is precisely what makes this moment so unpredictable. The State Department statement, now circulated to every major ally, was designed to signal that Washington is not willing to abandon Taiwan under any circumstances. Chic. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said plainly that Beijing's military response was inconsistent with maintaining peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. That is diplomatic language for, we see what you're doing, and we're not backing down. You don't usually hear that tone from the State Department unless something serious is at stake. The White House followed with its own statement, emphasizing that the arms transfer was consistent with longstanding U.S. policy and that any attempt to change Taiwan's status by force would be met with appropriate response. Translation: the United States will intervene if necessary. Meanwhile, Taiwan's President Lai addressed the nation in a measured, powerful speech tonight. He said, Taiwan will never accept coercion as a substitute for dialogue. He said, we do not seek conflict, but we will not surrender our freedom to avoid it. And he said, the people of Taiwan have chosen democracy, and no amount of military pressure will change that choice. These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a nation that understands just how high the stakes have become. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Beijing's latest moves weren't isolated. Along with the military mobilization, Chinese state media launched a coordinated disinformation campaign targeting Taiwan's population cyber attacks, increased against Taiwan's government infrastructure economic pressure, intensified, with Beijing restricting imports of Taiwanese agricultural products. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When China moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. This is hybrid warfare. This is strategic pressure applied across every domain simultaneously. Analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Beijing is preparing for a sustained pressure campaign designed to exhaust Taiwan's resources and fall. Another is that Beijing is attempting to establish new baselines for military activity in the strait, making what was once provocative seem routine. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Beijing is testing response times and coordination to identify vulnerabilities for future operations. But today, Taiwan and its allies took that card off the table. They didn't wait for escalation. They didn't hesitate to activate defenses. They didn't look for off-ramps before demonstrating resolve. They responded immediately, decisively, and together. What we're watching now is a test of will. Beijing wants to see whether sustained pressure can fracture the alliance. Taipei wants to show that democratic resolve is unbreakable. Washington wants to prevent miscalculation from spiraling into conflict, and the international community wants to prevent the Taiwan Strait from becoming the Taiwan Strait, from becoming the next flashpoint for great power war. Tonight, we've heard from Pentagon officials who are now monitoring Chinese military activity around the clock. They say Beijing has not withdrawn its naval assets from forward positions. They say aerial incursions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone have continued. And they say China's decision to mobilize on this scale is likely part of a longer-term strategy intended to normalize coercion as a diplomatic tool. But Taiwan is not backing down. In fact, Taiwan is leaning in. Their response today, swift, coordinated, and unwavering, sent a message to Beijing that intimidation will not work. And it sent a message to Washington that Taiwan is a partner worth defending. As the days ahead unfold, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Beijing hoped to achieve. But what we do know is that Washington's arms transfer was timely. It strengthened Taiwan's defensive capability at a critical moment. It demonstrated alliance solidarity when Beijing expected division, and it established a precedent that security commitments will be honored. What happens next will depend on what Beijing does in the coming weeks. If they de-escalate, this moment will be remembered as a successful demonstration of deterrence. If they escalate further, Taiwan and its allies have already shown they are prepared to respond. They have shown they are ready. And tonight, for the first time in years, Beijing appears to be recalculating. The Taiwan Strait is tense, dangerously tense. And when Beijing is recalculating, it means they are choosing their next move carefully. Funly, carefully. Because tonight, Beijing learned something they have learned many times before. Taiwan will not surrender. The alliance will not fracture. And democracy will not bow to coercion. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Taiwan stood firm. Washington stood with them. Washington stood with them. And the world is watching. And we will be here, watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.